Hi there, welcome to another episode of INNOQ Technology Lunch. Today my guest is Stefan Tilkoff and he will talk about why API first might not be a good idea. For all of you who don't know the procedure of INNOQ Technology Lunch, Stefan will do his talk and you have the possibility to ask your questions within the YouTube chat, and after his talk I will forward all of your questions to Stefan so he can answer them. So Stefan, have very much fun with your talk.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for the introduction. So, as Lisa said, my topic today is why API first might not be a good idea. And I know this is a little bit of a controversial statement, which is why I think it's good fun and a good thing to do in your lunch break. So I hope you have settled back nicely with something to eat. And I'll just, rant along for a while and hopefully we'll have some discussion afterward. So, API first is being mentioned and being sold to many people as part of what they call the API-driven enterprise. And I think that's a fantastic term. And if we look at the promises that people make with this term, I think they all sound perfectly awesome. Wouldn't it be great if we could easily create new applications just by orchestrating existing APIs? Wouldn't it be fantastic if we reduced time to market, because it was so fast to create new apps that it would no longer be something that limits us in the way we can do things, but rather something that actually excels and accelerates what we can do. Applications could be created by third parties. Somebody else might be able to create an app if we don't have time to do it ourselves or in the organization. So we could outsource it. Or even better, somebody could do it on their own. They would just start doing it because they want to do it, and they wouldn't even have to ask us, because we have those fantastic APIs for them to build upon. It would be great if the responsibilities were unambiguously defined. Somebody's responsible for providing an API to the outside world, and everybody can just use it and be happy with it. And the clearly defined contracts would exactly tell you what the API does and what the responsibilities of the consumers and the providers are. Wouldn't it be great if we had support for exposing capabilities on multiple different channels, right? Existing channels as well as new channels, like your standard web application, mobile application, but also fancy new things like maybe voice-driven things, or portable wearable stuff. It would be great if we could reuse functionality and data in many places, simply because they were hidden behind this clearly defined interface. And it would be fantastic if we had the ability to decouple business logic from user interfaces and channel details. If we could do the same thing, multiple channels, with a perfect match for this particular channel, that particular user experience. It sounds as if we finally have found the holy grail, right? If we only had APIs, everything would be perfect. And if we believe in this idea, if we believe that APIs are such a great idea, then maybe we should put them first. Maybe we should decide to start with APIs, not add them as an afterthought, but rather put them at the very beginning, right? Define a contract before we implement anything. Think of the way we want to expose things through our APIs to the outside world. Maybe we could add fantastically powerful API management software. I'm sure the vendor of such software would be very happy if we did that. So having something that takes away a lot of the burden that people associate with APIs would be really nice if we could just buy it out of the box, right? We could have a standardized versioning and documentation strategy. So all of the APIs in our enterprise would be documented the same way. The versioning strategy would maintain compatibility for a long time. We would have this growing pool of useful and reusable APIs, and we could reuse them in multiple levels. So the same API could be reused multiple times by different parties, but we could also do reuse across APIs. So maybe schema reuse or contract reuse, so the things that we've defined once could be applied in many situations. Now, that all sounds so fantastic that it seems as if it's too good to be true. And usually, in my experience, if something sounds too good to be true, it isn't actually true. And that I think is the case here as well. I'm not disputing all of these things. I think there are many positive things to be associated with APIs, but I think doing a talk about why APIs are great is a little bit boring. So I want to talk about the top 10 of strategic API problems. Why might it not be a good idea? What kind of problems might you run into? And why should you maybe not go for an API first approach in the first place? Now, of course, these are just some things, and I don't necessarily think I've put them in the perfect order, but this is the order that made the most sense to me. I'm sure you can think of five more things, and you'll be able to debate me on five of the ones that I present here, which is perfectly fine. So ideally, I would love to do this in a room where you raise your hand and shout and say, "This is all completely wrong. You're stupid," and things are completely different. So as we can't do that, please put your comments in the chat, as Lisa said, and we'll hopefully have a little bit of a debate afterwards. So let me start with my personal top 10 of API first problems. So the first one is one that I could have just as well put at the very end as number one, because it's sort of a basic kind of thing, right? It seems something that everybody can agree on is that you can't build an API unless you know what your users need. If your API is built based on a guess, then it's going to fail. And that is something that is true for almost any kind of software, right? So there's no reason why it shouldn't be true for an API as well. If you have this idea of what your users want, then that idea is very, very likely wrong. It doesn't matter whether what you're providing is a user interface or an application programming interface. You're providing it without a very clear understanding of what the needs of your consumers, your API users, is, then you will fail. And that's, even though that might seem a completely obvious thing, I find that it's ignored in a huge number of situations. Very often, things are driven by the capabilities of maybe a model or a database or some existing functionality, and it's exposed in this bottom up approach based on some idea of how this could possibly be used. But that's not driven from the actual needs that people have, it's rather driven from inherent capabilities or structures, and it'll always end up being something other than what people actually want. Now, this is true in general, whether you're building a new system or whether you're wrapping an existing system. But particularly if you're wrapping an existing system, if you have some piece of legacy software that you want to expose as an API, then you're limited by the capabilities of that particular thing. So, in some cases, creating an API for an existing piece of software can lead to a situation where you basically prolong the life of a bad thing. Maybe you should be replacing that thing. Maybe you should be changing that thing. And because you're wrapping it with an API, you're making it accessible to the outside world, but you're also sort of solidifying the facts, that the decisions that have been made for that particular system. So maybe that particular system incorporates logic that should be in three different systems. Maybe that particular system has lots of warts and lots of fixes for problems that only were there because of some specific internal structure. And you're all making that part of an API to the outside world. And you're thus creating a dependency on that. Many people will depend on that particular version of the API, and it will be really hard to make a change. And I see that this happens very often when people want to do a good thing. What they want to do is they want to create this API to encapsulate this functionality so that they can replace the system in the back by maybe a better one or a new one, but they can't because all of the bad things have now leaked into the API, and those bad assumptions will accompany you for a long time because you have to stick to them once somebody depends on them. So that is, I think, one of the reasons why APIs fail. Another reason, and my number 8 in my list, is that sometimes APIs are used as sort of a route to avoid doing the right thing. Sometimes it's a lot easier to build something that's really abstract, something that is, uh, you know, feels good from an engineering perspective. That might actually be something that you can do very quickly, very early on in the project. You can do that based maybe on some internal structure, like I said in my number 10. It's much easier to do that than to actually find out what people need, than to actually analyze stakeholder needs. So going to a lot of different people and figuring out what it is that they want, and then figuring out what the common subset of that is, if such a thing even exists, and then turning that into an API might be a lot harder than just creating something that's very, very abstract and very generic. One of my favorite examples here is the generic thing machine. I mean, I can create an API that allows me to create a thing and delete that thing and retrieve that thing. And update that. That's like a very generic thing machine, and that'll match any use case. Look at that. I'm done. I've created a fantastically reusable API. The problem with very reusable APIs is that they're often very useless. We'll get to that again in a few minutes. Reusable services in general have that problem, right? They end up being way too generic and way too data oriented. That's because data is sort of the common thing across many different use cases. They all share the same data. So we could go for these very generic data driven APIs. And if your goal is reusability, then that is a good strategy. Let's say your salary, your bonus is measured by how often something is reused. And the more reusable that thing is, the higher your bonus. You've fulfilled your KPIs, everything's perfectly fine. But on the other hand, you might not have created the value that you could have created if you went for something more specific. I've got an old diagram here that I've used a number of times, which sort of tends to highlight this based on a layering. This is just one example layering that an application could have. There is the data layer at the very bottom, and then there's some domain logic on top of that. And then there's maybe some process flow, and then there's some presentation logic. That's sort of the structure of many applications. Give or take a few layers, doesn't really matter. But roughly like this, you could imagine an API sitting at each of those layers. So at the lowest layer, it would basically just be JDBC or ODBC in disguise, right? You just expose your database in a slightly different way. Instead of connecting through a network protocol and sending SQL statements, you have something that is a little less capable, but at the same generic layer, right? So most people, I think, agree that this is a bad idea. If it were a good idea, then all our APIs would simply be created by installing a wrapper that simply exposes our databases. Actually, some people do that, but still claim that the majority of people think that is not a very good idea. And I would enthusiastically agree it's a very bad idea. But what we see very often is something on the next layer that sits on top of the domain logic. Now, this could be something where you have those fancy domain objects that actually encapsulate some business rules, right? So there's some extra referential integrity checks that are not kept in the database. Maybe there are some rules on how creating one thing might also create a few other things, and some events might be fired. There is actual logic at this level, and we're exposing that to the outside world, but it's still lower level or comparably low level compared to the next layer, where something would be very specifically targeted to one particular process flow, right? This is more the view of, I'm not manipulating the main object, I'm building part of a business process. Take, for example, a fact like in some maybe in some order management application, orders above a certain threshold have to be approved by a supervisor, or even by two supervisors, depending on some business rule, right? If it's from a particular country and exceeds a certain amount, then somebody has to approve it. Where should that rule be? Should it be in the consumer using the API, or should it be behind the API? Should it be something that is exposed as an API? My claim is that in the majority of use cases, you want that to be encapsulated by the API, because it's a business rule that is that encapsulates part of a process, but that is actually decided for every channel independent from the actual channel. It doesn't really matter whether I'm entering that order from a mobile phone or via the web app. That approval process is the same, no matter what the channel or the user interface is that I use to do that. So I build a very useful service that encapsulate that if I target that particular layer. So my claim here is, you want to go as high as possible with your APIs. You want to be as specific as possible with your APIs, and that'll cost you reusability, which is perfectly fine, because reuse should not be the major goal. Reuse is an interesting, nice side effect if it can be reused in multiple places, but it's not the number one goal that you have here, particularly not if you're not talking about a ton of different clients that we're exposing. My next statement is that APIs are often abused to solidify boundaries that shouldn't be there in the first place. So an API is a fantastic way to structure an interface. And it's great if that's a good API. That's much better than if it's a bad API. But maybe it shouldn't be there in the first place because the interface shouldn't be there in the first place. And my favorite anti-pattern here, and again, I'm reusing slides I, from another context, is what I call the horizontal Conway split. Now, this is something that we see happening a lot in many projects. And it typically happens if you have two groups of people. Um, these two groups of people have very, very different views on certain programming languages. Group one thinks that only very, very old people program in Java voluntarily, right? That is not a programming language that any modern person uses. That's kind of the new COBOL. Group two thinks that group one is full of fools and that nobody could possibly want to build any sort of logic in a language like JavaScript. Why would you ever want to do that? And these two groups exist in almost every, well, if you're not doing a Java project, then the first group maybe uses something else, right? It might use Scala or it might use C# or whatever language you prefer, right? The point here is that those two groups differ in opinions. They differ in their choice of favorite programming language. But what this turns into in many projects is an architectural decision. You have those two groups, you put them in layers, and then you have one group build a front end and the other group build a back end. And they can happily use whatever tools they favor, right? It's not as if that is the natural choice for those two things. It's not even the natural choice that these two things exist. Yet we put an API in between because that is the way to get the two groups to agree on something and to communicate. Because both the Java people and the JavaScript people can do with a JSON API, but does this mean that that's a good architecture for your particular problem? Again, my claim is that in the majority of use cases, it's not a good architecture because every meaningful feature will require both front end and back end work. There is nothing really useful that you can do just in the front end or just in the back end. Everything that interests me requires the work of two teams now and the synchronization of two teams and a meeting, worst of all, of two teams. So that is not a goal I think that you should have. What happens very often is that often the back end people aren't fast enough for the front end people. Whether that's justified or not doesn't really matter, but it's enough that the front end people think so. So front end folks will become full stack folks because they will simply solve problems on their own because they don't want to wait in the back end. They don't want to have that meeting, right? Because nobody wants to have meetings, if we're honest. Now, the key point here is that if the teams don't want to collaborate, then this well-defined interface contract actually addresses a symptom, right? The much better solution, in my view, would be for these two teams not to be two teams. If they're one team, then they're one full stack team, and they can collaborate on features. They can build those things. Now, does that mean that I want to have huge teams? Of course not. If that thing is too big, then of course you have to split it into multiple teams, but don't split them based on this horizontal layer. Split them based on other useful boundaries, like do some bounded context, domain-driven design, and figure out what the responsibilities are, and put them into several full stack teams that can do everything from end to end. We're sort of at the heart of the whole thing, so that's a thing that's very important to me. So I'm sure you'll have opinions on that as well. My next statement is that APIs almost never, and that's related, of course, fulfill user needs unless they're combined, unless they're orchestrated, which is the fancy word to say combined, to build something that's actually useful, right? And I think we have this view that once we have those services, and then the front end is just this easy thing, right? So we have this huge pool of fantastic services, and it'll be trivial to combine them. And I think the only people who think the front end is trivial is people who don't do front end development. Because in reality, front end is of course the most important thing, and it's actually the stuff that matters most. And backend architects like me fool themselves into thinking that they're the important people in a project. They're not. The front end people are way more important for a project's success, at least from a user perspective. Not saying that the backend people don't matter, of course not, but they're not as important as they think they are, because in the real world, a lot of stuff that you would like to be part of the backend APIs actually becomes part of the front end. You start building a lot of business logic because you have to figure out how to use those low level APIs to achieve something that is actually useful. And that's a lot tougher than people typically think. So they'll end up with this huge amount of logic of application logic that sits in the actual front end. Now, is that a bad thing or not? Well, I don't know. Maybe everyone's happy with the fact that the backend people build low-level APIs that don't do very much in a stable programming language, and the cool new stuff is being done in some more dynamic thing, right? If you're a strategic enterprise consultant, you can even turn this into a strategic architecture statement and talk about two-speed IT, right? And the backend stuff, those are the systems of record that don't change very often and don't have to be very fast. And the front end stuff is really the systems of engagement, all those bullshit terms that actually move very quickly, very dynamically, right? And so this is actually how it's supposed to be. I just don't think that's true. I think it's just lipstick on a pig. You have a very bad situation, and giving it fancy names doesn't turn it into a good situation. But you're not actually improving anything by doing that. Particularly not if you have multiple front ends now. If you have multiple places where this logic is implemented in a similar but not identical way, then you'll end up with the fact that anything that is useful, any meaningful change now requires the synchronization of multiple teams. So it's even worse than my horizontal Conway split situation on its own if you have a single front, because now you have multiple front ends. This is like somebody has to say, we'll have to fix this, and then they'll have to talk to the iOS team and to the Android team and to the web app team and to the backend people, and they all have to figure out how to do that so that this change actually gets put into production. I think that is a key problem of APIs that aren't high level enough. And of course, you can address that by not having an API at all, which is going to be another thing that we'll talk about very soon. My next statement is that an API as such is not a value, is not valuable. An API is only valuable if it actually, well, provides value. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that you can't pat yourself on the back if you have created a lot of APIs. That's not a goal. That's not a meaningful API. Of course, if you're in a group, if you're in the API management or in the API creation group, then maybe somebody has put a KPI in your yearly goals or your OKRs that says you have to create at least 250 APIs this year to be successful. I'm not sure that's a measure of success. It explains why some people measure APIs by counting operations instead of interfaces, right? Because you suddenly have a whole lot more. Create customer, wow, a new API. Update customer, hey, another new API, awesome. And I wish I were joking, right? I'm really not. I'm definitely not joking. Um, these things are not valuable. They're valuable if they create something extra, right? If they add something. So a good example would be that you have a new business model. You have a capability that you only used internally before, and your organization has already used that capability to provide all the value it can do. But now you can open that up to the outside world. A business partner can now do something with it that you yourself can't do. That is extra value. And then I'll say this API is very valuable and a very cool thing. So you should do it. But that is an API that is justified, where you're justified in building it. And I like those. I just hate the others, right? If you have a good reason, that's perfectly fine. Because, and that's my number 3 statement here, it is really, really friggin' hard. It is not easy at all to build good APIs. API design is really, really hard. API design requires schema design. It requires protocol design, because every API you build, depending on, of course, slightly depending on what kind of technology or approach you use, but you always do a little bit of protocol design. You figure out what is the right sequence of the consumer has to call these things to get something done. It's really, really, really hard to change those things, to evolve those things, because when you evolve them, you don't typically evolve just a single piece of it. You have to evolve the whole thing. And ideally, you don't want to break anything. You want to avoid breaking changes at all costs, because people will hate you for it. You don't want to be hated, so you'll try to not break your consumers. You also always destroy a lot of value if you break your consumers, which is another very good reason why you should avoid it. And all this talk about versioning doesn't really help, because most often a versioning strategy is just making explicit that you failed, right? I mean, just just tag on a new version, major version number because I just did a breaking check. How is that a solution to anyone's problem? Just makes it, you just declared to the outside world that everybody has to change all of their consumers. But that is the easy way out. The much harder way is to figure out how to do things in a non-breaking way. All I'm saying is this is a hard thing, and you should really have very good reasons to do it. And if you want to do it, then you have to spend a lot of time on it. And it's very often easier to use something that's already there or avoid having to do it in the first place than to try and come up with a good thing. I think we've learned this in other places. So I'm old enough to remember a time when XML was a really cool thing and everybody wanted to do and use XML in all places. And for a long time, people just designed XML vocabularies. That was kind of a thing people did, right? You could buy very thick books. We still have them in the library down here, where you could read about XML schema design. How do you come up with good vocabularies? And that's really, really, really hard, which is why essentially people have stopped doing it. And it actually hasn't become easier if you just do away with the pointy brackets and replace them with others. JSON doesn't fundamentally change that. It might be a little easier on the typing, but it's not a fundamental change. It's still very hard to come up with good APIs and good schemas. Another thing is that API design, specifically API first design, lends itself to visionary thinking, and that is a big risk, right? Because very often those visions of rich API repositories and landscapes remain just that, visions, right? It's this idea the world would be so perfect if we had those things, but really it's not. Um, I was in a very early SOA project over a decade ago at a very, very large company, and I was again at that company 2 years ago when it was retired. So it was like 8 years of the idea of building this rich API landscape with a managed repository with a taxonomy and descriptions and a process and an Eclipse-based design tool and fantastic quality requirements and quality gates and reusable strategies. And it all completely failed because it did not actually provide value unless you consider nice documents or PowerPoint slides as value, which I don't. Usually, not doing an API might be your best strategy, right? So unless providing API is your business model, the best API is no API. This is actually more of a statement than of a problem, right? But it's fundamentally at the heart of what I'm trying to say that building an API has a lot of cost, and you should be really, really, very, very sure that it's worth doing before you start that endeavor. If your API is your business model, things are completely different. So one of our clients is a bank that is not a bank, that is actually providing its capabilities to others as an API. It's the very core of this company is being an API bank. That's a very cool concept, and I'm sure it translates to many other companies as well, whose key business model is exposing an API, and that's perfectly fine. I'm not suggesting that is not a good idea. As again, I'm not suggesting it's not a good idea to expose an API when it makes sense. Just don't do it for everything, but you don't have to. So let me get to my takeaways. You might have figured out that I think APIs are not a silver bullet, right? That is no surprise anymore. So I'll skip over that pretty quickly. Um, the second most important takeaway that I want to leave you with is that you have to have APIs driven by actual application use cases. You really need to know what it is you're supporting here. Some application must be sitting there waiting for you to actually provide it with that capability. Then you have a chance of building a good API. If you don't know what that application is, you can't build good APIs. It's completely impossible to build them, and then just have them used a while later. Just that's not how things work. APIs are really hard, right? Only build those that are really worth it, because you have to be careful with your resources, with your time and effort that you're able to spend on that stuff. So spend it wisely and make sure the few APIs that you build are really, really good APIs, as opposed to building a ton of them that all suck. That's not something you should strive for. And finally, I've tried to sum up everything, like the takeaway, into this little statement here. I think applications should become before services, right? That's what you want to have first. You want to start with the actual end user use case. You want to use them before you think of reuse, right? Before you build something that's so reusable it's completely useless, go for something that is used once by this one particular application. And then once you've built maybe this thing a number of times, then you can figure out what you could generalize. So go for the specific before you try to generalize. It's more of a general statement. You can apply that to any sort of software engineering, but I think it's particularly true if we're talking about. And that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening. I'm really looking forward to some discussion. I hope we have some questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. There were a few questions in the chat. I would like to ask them first, and afterwards I can hand you over some of the discussion statements.
Mhm.
So let's start with the questions. I will go from the last question to the first, so you
Okay.
know which order I do. And there's another question. So we have 4 questions and then discussion. Christian Franzen asks, I'm wondering how front-end and back-end can communicate without using an API, or is an API something to you that has been published, is known outside of the team?
So, of course, this is very. First of all, it's a very good question because it addresses a real problem, right? That people have to figure out how they can work together, and so it's absolutely valid to ask that. The second thing is it depends extremely on your choice of technology. Are we talking about a mobile application? Are we talking about a web application? What kind of web application are we talking about? Do we have different kinds of clients? So let's maybe start with one example, which would be the typical web application. For a web application, you could decide to have one team that builds the front end part, let's say, as a single page app, and another team would build the backend APIs that the single page app calls. And this very much lends itself to this horizontal Conway split architecture, and it works nicely because you have those two separate teams that really have completely different technology choices. And the backend people that provide those APIs will typically expose JSON APIs via HTTP. Another architecture would be to have a combined team that simply delivers that stuff from the server side. So they would generate HTML on the server as opposed to something on the client. And then you'd have a team on the server side that would provide HTML that would be consumed by the browser and would then maybe incorporate components that use JavaScript driven by that HTML stuff. So that's it. I'm not, well, I have very strong opinions which architecture I prefer. But apart from that, I think it shows that there is a different kind of applicability of those choices depending on the technology that you chose here. But even if you don't do that, even if you let's say stick with a single page app example, you could decide to have different parts within the single page app, or maybe it's not not a server-side rendered HTML app, but maybe not a single, but a multi-page app or something like that, right? That has multiple different parts developed by different teams, and those teams could be composed by people where some of them build front-end parts, and some of them build back-end parts, and of course they have them communicate in some way, but it's not a published API, right? So that addresses, I think, the comment here. If it's an implementation detail within the team, I wouldn't call it an API, right? I mean, otherwise we could start talking about the browser using HTTP to grab pages from also be an API that leads us nowhere. So I think the key distinction here is, do I make it a published API or not? And I think that if you're trying to build a single thing, then it's always a good idea not to cut that apart by putting an API in the middle of it.
Okay. So Brolytic was wondering very much at the beginning of your talk, why shouldn't teams not want to communicate with each
Mhm.
other? So
That's yeah. I always make those teams half jokingly, right? So I don't think people should not communicate. I think communication is absolutely key, and friendly team communication is really awesome. I just think that there is a lot of thing. There is a lot you can get done in a small and focused group. That I think is sort of the key idea of the agile movement, right? You have this magical number, whatever it is, 7 people plus or minus 2, whatever, that can get stuff done very quickly, specifically if they have end-to-end responsibility. So that is something I would always try to achieve. If the problem is too big to be addressed by 7 people, then maybe I need multiple teams of that size. They will all do a lot of their stuff internally, so they'll talk to each other all day. They'll communicate a lot, and they will get things done because they have this super high bandwidth communication among themselves. And when they talk to other teams, that's sort of the exception, not the rule. They don't have to talk to other teams all the time for every single thing that they want to get done, because otherwise, if they do that, you create a lot of synchronization effort. You lose a lot of time. You have people waiting on each other because they're waiting on on that team, and that team is waiting on that team. So it all slows down drastically if you can't get stuff done within a single team. So that's my reason why I think that you should try to, and that again is outside of this talk, right? But you should try to strive for largely autonomous teams. Now, our colleague Gerrit will be the first to point out, actually has pointed out recently in a talk, and he should do that in a tech lunch as well, um, that specifically, if you want autonomy, you need a lot of communication, but you need communication about something different. You need communication about the small amount of rules and the small and very rigidly enforced rules that allow this autonomy, because after all that stuff, that will have to collaborate. Otherwise, it wouldn't be one system, completely separate systems. But if they have to integrate somehow, then you have to figure out what is the right strategy to get those teams to act autonomously most of the time, but still work together when they have to.
On one of your first slides, you had a small diagram, and Patrick Cornelissen asked, is process flow really a separate layer, or isn't it just a part of the domain logic layer anyway?
Arguably, it is, yes. So you could definitely have that. The point I was trying to make is that not that I think it's a good idea to have those two layers, rather that many people draw the API line sort of at this thing, and they think process is something that is part of the consumer. And I think that it's also related to this whole idea of orchestration, right? So saying I call this API and then I get that result, and with that result I call that second API, I get that result, then I combine the two and call the third API, and then I have everything to create I don't know, maybe a piece of user interaction that I then present to the user. That sort of is business logic to me, right? That is not if I have to do that stuff in the consumer, then I have put a lot of business logic outside of my API. And I think it's typically much better if that is behind the API. If you look from the client side, right, to the server side, if it's behind the API, because that allows the API provider to change that thing centrally, which I think is what most people aim for when they build APIs, right? They want to have the business rules encapsulated and exposed via an API, so that if I change, let's say, my approval logic for orders, right? Because if they come from a certain country, I want them extra vetted or something like that. Then I want to do that in one place. If I can do that in one place, change it, and it's immediately active everywhere, then that is, I think, what most people have as their goal, as opposed to having to change tons of applications that have to go through some app store approval process before I have that change in production. Nobody wants that.
I'm excited for the next question and your answer for it. So Misha says, is the solution for many points GraphQL?
Oh, that's an interesting one. So we had a interesting enough. Last week we had an internal debate about the pros and cons of GraphQL, right? So I can only share my personal view, and I'm totally aware that this is the thing where your opinions can differ. I think that there's a risk with GraphQL that you build exactly this kind of data API that I don't like. Where if you use GraphQL to expose something that shouldn't be exposed, you actually enforce exactly what I was talking about a minute ago, namely too much business logic within the client. If you have multiple clients that all can very easily now implement business logic because they have this generic GraphQL thing that they can talk to, then you have all of those problems that you get by having multiple clients. Now, I'm aware that you don't have to do that with GraphQL. You can use it differently. After all, you could expose exactly the same capability in, let's say, via RESTful HTTP JSON API and a GraphQL API without making any changes in the layers, but it sort of lends itself to something. And the fact that it was created at Facebook, where they wanted to have more logic or more capabilities in the clients that use this generic thing, sort of points in that direction. So I'm not a big fan personally of using GraphQL for generic API use cases, and I think it actually is very often used um, to address a symptom rather than the cause, namely that these teams are not full stack teams. That said, GraphQL I think is a very very good match for a certain kind of use case. So one example that I recently saw was a product that essentially maintained a graph-like data structure. That was the product. The product did just that. It didn't provide additional capabilities on top of that. Its key feature was to provide this graph-like structure to the outside world, and GraphQL was a fantastic match for exposing that because it's a standardized syntax. You get tons of tools. People know it. People can easily use it. So why wouldn't you want to do that? Before I build something that looks like GraphQL, I would rather use it. So it's not as if I'm saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying that in many cases it's used, or it maybe leads you down the wrong path.
John Joy has another question. So does it mean that UI first would be a better strategy as the UI lies in the close proximity to the user's actual needs, and essentially UI development ideally drives API development?
If you ask me, I would enthusiastically say yes. It's much much better to do UI driven development. I know this flies in the face of many backend architects' core beliefs, but I'm a backend architect myself, right? I can't do UI development. I'm super bad at that. It's not something that anybody should ever have paid me for, and mostly nobody has done that. So I'm really a backend person. I still think that we should more often drive things from the user, let's say from the user interaction point of view. I'm not sure user interface. I'm not, I'm not talking about the position of buttons or something. Not that I don't consider that important, but I'm not talking about the visual aspect of it. What I'm talking about is the um, let's maybe talk about what a good application is. A good application is one that provides you with all the information that you need to make a decision. Not much more, but that it gives you all the information you need to make a decision, and it gives you the options to make the decisions that make sense in this particular context. And if you make one of those decisions, then you get presented with the next thing, right? So you you sort of the application supports you and asks you to do something to express your intent, and then gives you the next thing. So that actually is to me the hallmark of a good application. And if that's what drives the rest, that's perfectly fine. It's also a very nice match actually for something like a RESTful API, right? So I'm a big. It's no secret that I'm a big fan of this REST thing, and that actually is built exactly for that because the web is built for exactly that. I provide you with a set of information with some affordances that you can use to make something with that, and all the logic is behind that API on the server side, right? Because that makes a decision of what happens next. I don't do that as in the client. I don't want to have a different application for every use case. I want to have this on the server side as much as possible. But
Brombert here asks, are we then talking about a UI first approach with UI first?
I would like to call it a user first approach. I much prefer that to an API first approach because that is fundamentally a technically driven approach. Now, if you think of the exception that I mentioned, which is a company or an organization whose business model it is to provide APIs, obviously the users are the consumers. So then it makes total sense to think of what are maybe the developers, what do they want? How do they figure out how to use the API? How can I make it as convenient as possible for them to use it? Maybe that's the most important thing because maybe the developers are my most important users. That could be, of course, they want to have something that at runtime also provides value, of course, but the interaction surface that they have with the whole thing is the usability of the API. So maybe that's then developer driven because the developers are my users. But yes, I think user first is much better than API first. Might actually, if I'm allowed to use that as a nice summary, extra summary slide in the next version of this talk.
Mhm. I think we have time for one last question. Martin Müller asks which definition of done you are preferring for delivering a new feature. How about done when in production?
That doesn't seem to have anything to do with anything else we talked about, but it's a very good question. So why not answer that as well? I think Unless you have very good reasons not to go into production, like maybe regulatory compliance reasons, something like that, then staging might be good enough. Otherwise, I think that's a very good thing. I mean, done when in production, done when successfully used in production, is a very nice definition of done. Quite a lot.
Okay. So thank you very much for your talk and your answers, Stefan.
Thank you
Thank
for the awesome questions. That was very cool.
Thank you all for listening. If you liked this episode, you can hit the thumbs up button below the video. And if you want to hear about news coming up, you can ring the small bell. And in 2 weeks, there's another episode, but this will be in German again. There will be Theo Pack, and the topic is, I say it in German because it's the German topic, zuverlässige Systeme durch die Reduzierung des Blastradius. So thank you very much and have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.